Now let's implement post in our new trip controller. The first thing I like to do is go ahead and set up the request so I kind of have a sense of what is going to be required of my new method. So let's change this to a post. And then the natural way that REST APIs work is that these verbs over here are mapped to different operations. Get meaning a read, post meaning an insert, put and patch meaning updates, delete meaning deletes, etc. So for our need, I'm just going to create the ability for our API to create a new trip. So this post is now going to go to the same URI as we saw in the get. This difference in verb is what's key in telling it what kind of operation we're looking at. But if we're going to create a new trip, we're going to want to supply some data to it. We can do that in the body of the request. This can be of different formats, but most likely what we want to test is what we're going to be doing from JavaScript, which is raw application/JSON type data. So here I'm just going to write some raw JSON. If you remember, each of our trip has a name, and I'll call this our Southern Tour. And we could add other pieces of information, but let's start with a really simple minimum version of the post so we can see how it works. If we go ahead and just send this, unsurprisingly, we're going to get a not found. Because even though this URI works for a get, the code doesn't know about our need to have a post yet. So let's go ahead and implement that on the controller. So let's just create a new method. And these names aren't crucially important. I like to use the same names as the verbs just so they are self-documenting. But if you wanted to call it something else, it's not actually required, because the way we specify it as a post is with the attribute. We're saying we want a post, and we want that post to go to the same URL. Now this brings up a question about using these attributes for the routes. Would it make more sense to do this in startup and have our own map route for the entire controller? And maybe that may be a viable solution, but by using the attributes, we're putting these routes pretty close to what the API actually needs. But we might not want to repeat the URI in each one of these, especially if we have to go make a change later of deciding to change what the URI looks like. We can do that by adding another attribute on the class called route. And route is specifying the root route for the entire controller. So this will be the API trips. And then the route here on each of the methods is going to extend what is in that main route. So by putting empty, it's saying, by specifying an empty string, we're telling it to use just this as our URI. Later on, we can have other methods that extend that by asking for, let's say, an ID of a trip to get an individual trip back. We have our post method here that is expecting a post to the same URI, so we can start to deal with implementing that. First thing we're going to want to do in the post is say, how are you going to pass me in that data? And we could certainly do things like string, name, date, time. You could even create parameters for other properties, but for now, let's go ahead and say, put name in there for now, right? And let's return JSON true, just so we have a result that's going to come back. We're really just going to set a breakpoint here, so you can see what's actually being passed in. So let's run it, and then over in Postman, let's execute it. And here we end up in our call here, and the name is null, because we're not really binding it correctly to the properties. What we really want to do is bind it to a complex class that represents the different parts of the data that exist. We can do this by changing this to trip. I'll just call that new trip for now. If we run this again and tell Postman to execute it, we're still coming in here, but we're still not getting the new trip. Notice that all the properties are null. We're not getting that most important name being specified. The reason is it assumes these are going to be query string parameters. So what we need to do is annotate this with another attribute that says from body, which basically tells the system, try to map what is in the body of the request to the parameter here. So let's run it one last time, and then Postman will send again. Now our new trip contains Southern Tor, so we have the correct name. We're getting a new instance of this trip with the properties that exist in the body mapped to it. This is the essential nature of model binding, is we're taking that data, bringing it in, and trying to map .NET types from JSON types and from JSON types back to .NET types. But at this point, what we're bringing in with the new trip, we have no idea whether this is good and valid data. So let's take a look at that next, using validation and view models.